Okay, great. Why don't we get started? I'd like to make this an hour, take an hour of your time. I think this will be a very educational 1 hour. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. So it's Olena Nikolayenko in the Department of Political Science and John Davenport in the Department of Philosophy. And they both thought very hard and deeply about the issues of what's going on in Ukraine. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor over to Olena, and then she'll speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go to John for about 10 minutes. And then we'd love to hear questions and just have a dialogue about what's happening in Ukraine. So Professor Nikolayenko, I'll hand the floor over to you.
I think there's two people in the waiting room, just so you know.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to Professor Tampia for organizing this event, and for Professor Davenport for agreeing to join it on a very short notice. Thank you, everyone, for taking an interest in the topic and attending this event on a Friday afternoon. At 5 a.m. on February 24th, 2022, the Russian army launched airstrikes on Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine, and started the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. It harkened back for many Ukrainians the memories of events that unfolded in 1941, when at 5 a.m. on July 4th, 1941, the Nazis bombed Kyiv. And now it is the Russian military that unleashes heavy bombardment of Ukrainian cities and small towns. And as you can see in this map of Ukraine, some Russian troops advanced from the north to the capital city, while others invaded Ukraine from the south in an attempt to occupy cities along the Black Sea and Azov Sea. And Kherson has been occupied by the Russian forces, and now they're making an advancement toward another big city in the region, which is not on the map, Mykolaiv, and then Odessa. Many Ukrainian cities are also small towns were pounded by heavy artillery using rocket launchers. And there are also currently reports that the Russian military brought vacuum bombs and used them in the Sumy region, also known as aerosol bombs. These bombs have a vacuum effect when all oxygen is extracted from air, and it ruptures human lungs and internal organs. So thousands of people, including many civilians, have been killed as a result of Russia's invasion. And just yesterday, the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, published on its YouTube channel and its website 45-second footage of the devastating effects of Russian bombardment of a Ukrainian town, which is located just 30 miles from Kyiv. So I wanted just to show you what it looked like. There won't be any sound, but you will be able to just see what I'm talking about when I say that Russia is bombarding Ukrainian residential areas. It's just 45 seconds. Yeah, I'll stop here. But you can see that, contrary to what Putin claimed, it's not a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine. In fact, it's, I'll stop sharing this and then just in a second. Indeed, it's just
If I do have to deal with
it's just a war that involves that results in the deaths of thousands of civilians in the country, and they are targeting not just defense infrastructure, but also they're targeting many residential areas. And as a result of this ongoing violence, right now there are over 1 million refugees from Ukraine. Many of them are fleeing to Poland. Poland has been a safe haven for many refugees from Ukraine. And according to some estimates, there are currently over 500,000 refugees inside Poland alone. And one of the graphs here that you can see shows that approximately 100,000 people, children, little children and women in Poland on a daily basis. And some refugees are fleeing to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, or Moldova. Poland is located closer to the border, and the city of Lviv is just located 50 miles from the Polish border. And many women with little children had to walk a long distance and sleep outside with freezing temperatures just to get to the border and escape this atrocities that are happening right now across the country. So before I discuss what might be done, let me briefly mention a couple of factors that led to the war. I want to first point out some processes that unfolded within Russia and then the broader international context. Vladimir Putin has ruled over Russia for the past 22 years. He was first elected as president in 2000, and after 2 consecutive terms, he just swapped places with his prime minister and then returned back in office. But de facto, he was in charge of the country for more than 2 decades. And Putin believes that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. He is on a mission to reassert Russian greatness and revive the Soviet Union in a new format. When Russians annexed Crimea in 2014, as you can see in this graph, the approval rating of the incumbent president skyrocketed. And many Russians were joyed the fact that Russia grabbed a part of Ukraine's territory, and they ignored the fact that it was implemented in defiance of international laws. And now, unfortunately, many people inside Russia continue to rejoice and feel that Russia is doing the right thing by penalizing Ukraine for choosing Europe over Russia, for choosing to develop closer relations with the European Union and move in the direction of becoming a full-fledged democracy and develop a different political system and economic system from Russia. And it's quite striking how the incumbent government in Russia succeeded in propagating anti-Western views in Russia. A lot of Russians like to travel to Western Europe, have a vacation in Paris, send their kids to study in London, or go, shopping. And of course, not everyone, but some wealthy ones in New York City or Milan. But at the same time, public opinion polls conducted by the most reputable, maybe the only reputable public opinion company in Russia, the Levada Center, indicate that over 2/3 of Russians consider the United States as enemy number one. And as you can see, in 2021, for example, Ukraine was the enemy number two, right after the United States. That's why now, even when anti-war protests are held in some Russian cities, they are quite small. Just to give you a specific example, Moscow, the capital city of Russia, has a population of approximately 12 million people, and only a few hundred dare to go and participate in anti-war protests. Most Russians are saying that they're afraid to get arrested, and that's why they stay silent, they stay at home. Another factor, just another thing that I think illustrates very well divisions across Russia and Ukraine is by just looking at the position of religious leaders in Russia and Ukraine. Rabbi Moshe Reuven Azman is currently in the capital city of Ukraine, in Kyiv, and he has recently recorded an address to the world with a Torah scroll in his hand inside a Kyiv synagogue. And in his appeal, he indicated that he urged the people that they should not stay silent to what is happening, what Russia is doing to Ukrainians. He urged people to speak up. And similarly, Rabbi Yakov, who is also, holding a leadership position in the Jewish community in Ukraine, recorded some messages that he posted on YouTube, and he condemned Russia's recent bombing of a Holocaust memorial in Kyiv, located near the city's TV tower. In September 1941, when the Nazis occupied Kyiv, approximately 33,000 Jews were killed in the ravine named Babi Yar. And now, when the Russians started bombing the city, some bombs dropped on the site of this memorial, killing people one more time again. Jewish leaders in Ukraine appealed to the world, and in particular to their counterparts in Russia, to speak up. And only after all those appeals, Russia's chief rabbi, Beryl Lazar, issued a very vague statement calling for some sort of peace negotiations. But he didn't go as far as to criticize the Russian government or Putin's policy in particular. And unfortunately, a lot of people in Russia remain silent, or most likely are going to participate in the mobilization the new mobilization that the Russian government is planning to unveil to recruit more men to fight in the war on Ukraine. But another factor that also played a role in empowering and emboldening Russia in the post-Soviet region is Western foreign policy. It's not the first time that Russia occupies a land of another state, of a neighboring state in the post-Soviet region. In August 2008, Russian tanks rolled in the Republic of Georgia, located in the South Caucasus. The Russian army occupied 20% of Georgia's territory, including South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But at that time, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, President Bush issued a public statement expressing deep concern of the situation in Georgia. And then shortly afterwards, when President Obama met with Dmitry Medvedev, he launched the reset the button policy in an attempt to try and find areas for cooperation between the two countries and ignore or downplay Russia's belligerent policy in the region. And then in 2014, actually, sorry, it's a mistake here. It happened the same year. Also in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. Then in 2014, Russia provided military backing for rebels in eastern Ukraine. Western diplomats, Western governments, again, expressed some concern, imposed some soft sanctions just to signal their disapproval of Russia's foreign policy. But in reality, they continued to maintain diplomatic relations with Russia. They continued to trade with Russia and buy the energy resources, which de facto provided financing for Russia's military machine. And of course, another very outrageous example of how Russia defied the international norms folded in Syria when Russia also backed up Assad regime and nonetheless managed to maintain relations with the West. So over the past decade or more, Western governments tried to appease Russia. They assumed that if Russia takes over just one piece of land, a piece of Moldova, a piece of Georgia, a piece of Ukraine, then the incumbent government in Russia can be appeased and the West can continue to have economic, political, or cultural relations with Russia, overlooking its military interventions or operations in the region. But of course, as we can see now, this policy might not work very well. And there are many things that Western governments can still do. It's self-evident that there is a large humanitarian crisis now in Ukraine, and the refugees are in high need of support as they're fleeing the country with just a few basic things like a small backpack, whatever, and they need a place to stay, or some means to survive. And of course, the Polish government is doing a lot to help them out, and a lot of civic organizations in Poland in particular providing critical assistance for Ukrainians. the Ukrainian army is still in high need of military aid, and there are a lot of weapons that Western governments can still provide so that Ukrainians can fight against Russian aggression. But one of the things that many people in Ukraine, including the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, appeal for is the introduction of no-fly zone over Ukraine. I have just shown you some images of what Ukrainian town looks like after Russia's bombardment, and without the introduction of no-fly zone over Ukraine, it's very difficult for Ukrainians to stop Russia's violence, Russia's advance, and the destruction and the killings of people. Now, I think a lot of Western politicians are wary of introducing this policy because it would mean that Russian planes should be shot down, and Western governments, the United States, Germany, and others are not willing to go that far because they're afraid of another escalation, as they say. But just yesterday, one of the largest nuclear power plants in Ukraine has been under the fire as a result of Russian attacks. And there are also reports that the Russians had trying to take control over a nuclear power plant near the capital city of Kiev. So they are definitely, considering different options, and the United States and the Western states have the military capacities to confront Russia, but they are reluctant to do it. And this is a source of frustration for many people in Ukraine because the world is watching and not willing to go that far. And of course, on the military front, Russia's economy is dependent on the sale of oil and gas, and if many European countries reduce their dependence on Russian energy resources and stop buying from them, it would significantly undercut their ability to finance the war. And in conclusion, I just wanted to mention a few resources. I can share these slides with Professor Tampia, and he can distribute it among students if anyone is interested. But there are a lot of different civic initiatives in the United States trying to organize or coordinate some actions to donate money for the refugees or hold anti-war protests. I think one of the best, most updated websites on the topic is called Stop Putin, and they have a list of charity organizations there, and also anti-war protests. For example, there will be a protest held tomorrow on Saturday, on March 5th at 1 p.m. in the Times Square. If you're interested to learn more about current events in Ukraine, from Ukrainian media, there are several media outlets that either published in English, like Kyiv Independent, or have English language versions, like the newspapers New Time and Ukrainian Truth. And the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard compiled a list of some resources to provide some background information related to the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I'm going to stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have related to the situation in Ukraine.
Professor Nikolayenko, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. I think we should go to John Davenport and let him speak for a while. If people have questions and they want to put them in the chat, I think that's a great way to continue the conversation until we can get ready for the sort of the question and answer period at the end. So John, Professor Davenport.
Sure. Would you like me to share my screen?
Yeah, I made you co-host.
Okay, good. I think I should be able to share this document. I mean, I have a lot of sort of historical background here. Can you all see this? Maybe I need to make it larger. Expand this just a little. I mean, I guess, Nick, it's totally up to you, but I'm willing to, to go straight to questions if people want to ask any. I mean, my part of this was sort of to review a little bit of the history since the 90s. I could do that quickly unless, does anybody have like an initial question they want to shoot out? If I may take the liberty to ask.
Well, why don't you take a few minutes just to give a little explanation? Then I like the idea of questions kind of soon.
Sure. Yeah, just, because, well, on a lot of the current issues, of course, I agree with what Olena just said. And I agree especially with the theory that, showing weakness in response to what happened in Georgia and Crimea, the Donbass region I'm about to talk about in eastern Ukraine, and then especially in Syria, it has been very important in shaping Putin's current belief that he can largely get away with doing this. And I think, even without a military response from NATO countries, he's probably been surprised just at the amount of economic sanctions and resistance and willingness to arm very late in the game, in some cases, to arm the Ukrainian armed forces. So, I mean, I think those moments in the last 20 years have really led to, appeasement has led to where we are today. But let me just take a minute here you've already seen the map of Ukraine with indications of the forces in the south converging from two directions, from Belarus towards Kyiv, and also from this direction from the northeast towards Kyiv. And the effort clearly underway now, to cut off Ukraine on the entire southern coast, right? So that things couldn't be shipped in that way. Let's go back a little bit, though, to the end of the Soviet Union, because this probably is a crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding Putin's attitude. And I want to say at the beginning, I don't think we should assume, despite all the propaganda, in Russia and the opinion polls there, I don't know that we should assume that by the end of this, that, a huge majority of Russians are going to be happy with what's been done. But of course, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a huge event in the lives of now many older Russians, and experienced as a national shame, I guess, by many. But of course, for people in Eastern Europe, a liberation from decades of reign of terror across, all of that swath of countries that were held basically as buffer zones between NATO and Russia. And that idea that, we could turn countries into buffer zones again seems to be coming back. It's very dangerous. So at the time, after the Berlin Wall came down, various countries in Eastern Europe were declaring independence. Ukraine, which had been one of the Soviet republics, itself held a national referendum to approve an act of independence enacted by the legislature in the Ukraine Soviet. And it was approved by 84%, by 92% of people across Russia. But very importantly, more than 4/5, even in those more Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine in the Far East and the northeast of Ukraine. And that's particularly important because it's those areas that, Putin has argued, people in those parts of Ukraine are being oppressed by the non-Russian speaking people of Ukraine. And this became his pretext for the current war. So the exit of the Ukraine Soviet really brought to the end the Soviet Union. It wasn't long after that it was declared no longer to exist and the Russian Federation was formed. Scroll forward 3 years, because Ukraine still retained nuclear weapons from the USSR period, something had to be negotiated about them, and they were handed over significantly to Russia in exchange for a solemn promise to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and even to refrain from economic coercion, which has been ongoing through various kinds of cyber attacks for years on Ukraine. So all of this, of course, has been violated since 2014, as you just heard in the prior presentation. And the attempt by Putin, not too long after his rise to power, which itself took place notably by the suppression of Chechnya, a secession movement in Chechnya, was based on the same kind of principle he now appeals to, that a different ethnic group, a different linguistic or religious group should be able to secede at will. Well, he also, bombed, if we have time, I'll show you pictures of Grozny in Chechnya, in 1999, 2000, to end that secession movement there. And this is what we're now unfortunately seeing in Ukraine, is this kind of, total war, this destruction of civilian housing, just as happened also in Georgia and then in Syria, as was indicated. So the attempt to try to control, let me back up here, to control Ukrainian politics for Putin began with the poisoning of Viktor Lukashenko, who survived the poisoning nevertheless and rose to the presidency. Hopefully I have all my history straight here. Who did he defeat? Well, the mayor, or the governor rather, of the Donetsk province in that Russian-speaking eastern area. There are two distinct provinces in what's together called the Donbas region. So that put a block on Putin's plans to control Ukraine through Viktor Yanukovych. However, and the conflict in Georgia came in between here. However, in 2010, after a few years of working with Paul Manafort, a name you may remember from the impeachment trials, an American lawyer and PR expert who helped Viktor Yanukovych win. Then Yanukovych expanded the power of the presidency in Ukraine, started a kind of kleptocracy there, gathered a lot of wealth into his hands and those of his cronies, and began to push Ukraine more closely towards Russia. But on the popular side, that's when the movement towards joining the EU was beginning and being pushed forward in the legislature and had a lot of popular support among the people. That's when Yanukovych finally said, no, we're not going to join the EU, and the protests broke out. What's called the Kiev protests in the Maidan, the central square in Kiev, that eventually ended with snipers on the roof and a crisis there, which led to Yanukovych fleeing. I personally think that part of what Putin's been doing since is to try to reverse this trajectory towards democracy, which was going on, for quite a while in the first decade of this century, and to get dictators to stand their ground, if you will, and not do what Yanukovych did. We see this with his support for Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, for example, and the dictator in Belarus last year, who faced hundreds of thousands of people in protests. So in this one case, though, Putin lost. His puppet was kicked out. The response was cyber attacks and the annexation of Crimea, along with sending unmarked army units in to help secessionist militias, well, partly to gin up these secessionist militias and then to arm them in this Donbas region. What happened as a result was a kind of off and on war there for 8 years, where the pro-Russian secessionists controlled this kind of part of the Donbas, but not the other part. And I think a lot of analysts, expected the main Russian advance to come sort of west through this region and on, but instead having a foothold in Belarus. A lot came from the north and then from Crimea in the south, and now an attempt to connect this area with Crimea. You see Mariupol down here, which has been one of the big conflict areas. And all across, if possible, the southern coast. So this itself was a big deal, the fomenting of secession in the Donbas region. And nevertheless, despite the fact, I'll skip over some of this about the cyber attacks, which were quite extensive. I have 3 bullet points on this. Nevertheless, despite all of this sort of effort to gin up secession in the Donbas, polls, fairly recent ones, showed that in the non-Russian controlled parts of the Donbas, Russian speakers, maybe Russian Orthodox Ukrainians, still more than like 2 to 1, did not want to become Russian citizens at the point of a gun. So I think, Putin has now probably succeeded in largely alienating those people in Ukraine who might have been at least inclined to say, well, I'm kind of Russian by culture or affinity or ethnicity or religion, but I'm a Ukrainian citizen may have voted, if they're older, for independence in 1991, but now, are totally alienated. And these are the people who supposedly Putin's advance was to save them from oppression, or even he accused Ukraine of committing genocide against them. Obviously, a completely specious lie, like basically everything he says. So now, total war, which we've been looking at, the indicators of this. This map is now a few days old, unfortunately, and these forces have advanced, I believe, through all of the Donbass region, and obviously from Crimea further north, and these forces in Belarus moving south towards Kyiv from this direction, and more from this direction, as we indicated. So that's about it from me. I have some suggestions as to what could be done. This is just a little graphic showing the use of Chechnyan mercenaries who have been brought in supposedly to capture and kill, with a kind of a kill list in hand to go after various leaders in Ukraine. And the Chechen mercenaries are reputed to be ruthless, whereas a lot of the Russian troops who ordinary Ukrainians are now facing in the street fighting, hand to hand almost in some places, are, let's face it, they're young Russian boys, may not have even known what they were getting into, arrived without even realizing they were going into Ukraine. In some cases may lack a strong will to fight. And so I'm not too surprised that there's now a new recruitment drive. I think this is an indication that this plan did not work as well as was anticipated. But we shouldn't fool ourselves. I mean, there's been a lot of sort of positive talk recently about, how, Russia's not succeeding as quickly. Its plans are going awry. There's going to be a long-term resistance here. It seems pretty clear to me that all of Ukraine will be occupied and controlled in one way or another. And what we're seeing now is the parts that can't be easily occupied will just get bombed into oblivion. And here maybe I will, if you can, take a look at a picture of Aleppo in Syria after bombing by Russian Air Force jets. So, here's the case again where there were no-fly zone requests for several years. There was a moment in 2013 where it seemed like Britain, France, and the United States were about to destroy Assad's Air Force. And then the Russian Air Force probably would have never undertaken its attacks in Syria, which then began in 2014. You can see just around the same time as the end of the Yanukovych regime in Ukraine and the seizure of Crimea and the Donbass. So this huge kind of set of initiatives on Putin's part to take control of the narrative and prevent the growth of democracy, and in particular to prevent these democratic transitions from happening in more countries, including, first of all, Syria. So this could have been prevented pretty easily by Western powers by simply shooting down the planes, just as could be done today in Ukraine. I have similar pictures of Grozny and Chechnya, but in the interest of time, I'll spare you. Do people have questions?
Well, Professor Davenport, thank you very much. Two very informative discussions. There's lots of comments in the chat, and so some of the questions. Maybe one. We'll start with Jose's question about NATO. Is NATO partly to blame, or is this purely on Putin? Maybe Professor Nikolayenko. What do you think? And then Professor Davenport, if you'd like to join in too, that'd be great.
Yeah. Yes, I think that initially, or in some conversations or public statements, Putin claimed that he's concerned about the expansion of NATO, that NATO is a threat to Russia's national security. But if we look at some of Putin's writings and his speeches, even the most recent addresses to the Russian nation, it's clear that he is obsessed with the idea of gaining full control of the territory of Ukraine. I think most recently, President of France, Macron, had a phone conversation with Putin, and afterwards, some news reports indicated that Putin is really determined to gain control over the territory of Ukraine in full. He doesn't want to have any sort of compromises. He just denies the fact that Ukraine should exist, or he denies the fact that Ukraine exists as a nation, that there is a Ukrainian nation, there is a Ukrainian state. He has this grand idea of building Great Russia. So even if Ukraine would declare that it would remain a neutral state, it would not save it from aggression. And we can see even how in some remarks by Russian politicians, they are now attacking verbally Finland, which is a neutral state. Yeah, and Finland back, in the 20th century, agreed not to join NATO to appease Russia. And now, following Russia's belligerent comments, this issue has come back and is seriously discussed in Finland because they locate, like, they're bordering Russia. They're just a few miles from, the Finnish border is just a few miles from St. Petersburg. And they feel threatened by what Russia is doing. So I don't think it's about NATO. It's or NATO membership.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to just add to that and say, Jose, no, I would say exactly the opposite of what you're suggesting. I hear this question a lot. Oh, haven't we done something wrong by expanding NATO to Russia's borders? The answer is no. We don't threaten Russia at all. NATO is a defensive organization. This is one of the things that Putin would like you to believe, that somehow NATO has done something wrong. In fact, I would say our biggest mistake in all this is not admitting Ukraine earlier. You can see that for years we held off admitting Ukraine to NATO because the thought was, oh, if we do that, Putin's going to invade Ukraine, right? He's going to start attacking more countries because he'll feel more threatened. You can see that the effort to appease him or to placate him has gotten us exactly nowhere. It's gotten us, a war in which there'll probably be, by the end of it, 2 or 3 million refugees. I would guess at least $300 to $500 billion of damage in Ukraine. The Russian people, their economy is going to tank 10 to 15%. This could cause a global, a worldwide recession. We've achieved absolutely nothing by not admitting Georgia and Ukraine. And for the kind of person we're dealing with in Putin, what he's done here is exactly the same as what Hitler did with the Sudetenland at the beginning of World War II. Appeasement didn't work there. What we should be doing now is match him tit for tat. This is the only thing that will work. Okay, Putin, you've done this. Guess what? We're going to, admit Georgia next year. And as soon as this war is over in Ukraine, we'll admit Ukraine as well. We're going to stand up a no-fly zone. If he takes further aggressive actions, maybe we'll get rid of the puppet regime that he's supporting in Venezuela. We're in a new Cold War here. If we don't act firmly and decisively, and Putin is doing this partly because he thinks we're weak-willed, right? That, countries in the NATO alliance don't have the will to fight. If we don't show that that's not true, we're going to end up by the end of this century with a world perhaps completely ruled by dictators. China will go into Taiwan. This is going to be like a series of dominoes falling one after another. There's already been a series of dominoes. Democratic protest movements failed in Belarus because they were crushed, right? This is the Putin doctrine, how to act. Same in Kazakhstan, same in Myanmar, same in Venezuela. I could go on and on and on. Democratic protest movement succeeded briefly in ousting the military dictatorship in Sudan. Now there's a military coup in Sudan. They're back. This is a worldwide phenomenon. NATO is the only organization on earth, unfortunately, that clearly stands up as an alliance against dictatorships.
Yeah, that's very important. I want to ask about Belarus, but
and in this case, the countries. Yeah, sorry. Let me go ahead. Yeah. I'll go on
Okay.
and on about this.
Yeah.
Thank
No,
you for
so if I may go on, so I mean, maybe we could. I'll skip the Belarus question and go to the no-fly zone. I mean, what do you think, Professor Nikolayenko? Does it make sense to do a no-fly zone? This was Professor Hinza's question. I mean, what can we do? I mean, is there a way to protect Ukraine without starting World War III?
Well, I think that a lot of, I mean, I don't see how militarily the Ukrainian army can stop the bombardment of Ukrainian cities without the introduction of no-fly zone. I mean, there are some special equipment. There are some military weapons that might be also helpful, but I think there are by now reports suggesting that when US officials visited Ukraine last year, they did not have a great deal of confidence in the Ukrainian army, and they assumed that the Russian armed forces would occupy the capital city of Kyiv within a few days, as Russians assumed that it would be sort of like a very quick operation. And that's why the US military was reluctant to provide Ukraine with powerful lethal weapons, because they assumed that they would end up in the hands of the Russians anyway. Now, of course, it's much more difficult to transport this critical weaponry to Ukraine because because of the situation on the ground, but also this equipment requires some training. So it takes time to train soldiers to operate this new military equipment. In the absence of foreign military personnel, it can be somewhat, problematic. But any day, that this kind of military aid is delayed means that more and more people are getting killed and cities are leveled. Professor Davenport showed images of Aleppo and Grozny. And this is the strategy that the Russian military has used consistently in foreign operations. They just chose to level the city, block by block, bomb the city, and then gain control over the territory in total disregard of the casualties, especially civilian casualties, that this policy would entail. The West is right now in conflict with Russia. I don't know how they imagine that they would be able to get out. Okay, the Russians will occupy Ukraine, and then the West assumes that Russia will be appeased, and business will, and the life will go on as usual. I don't know.
Yeah, can I say, again, it's just amazing how somehow all these European leaders just haven't learned the lesson of history.
Right.
They're desperate to avoid World War III. Well, could a little war earlier prevent a much bigger war later? I think this might be a case in point. I don't think, it's not that Putin is a huge bluffer. Oops, I hope I didn't just mess up this poll. Sorry, if I did, you might have to reissue it.
I'll relaunch it. I'm just kind of curious what people think. So.
Yeah, sure. I can speak more to the nuclear issue if people want. I wouldn't be fooled by any bluster and threat on that. Putin doesn't want to start a nuclear war. Plain and simple.
How much do you think you could explain events by Putin, the person, versus Russia's geopolitical interests or Russia's ideological sort of concern about say pan-Slavism or something like that? I mean, how much of it's personal and how much of it is something else?
Olena may be better able to speak to this, but I after watching Putin for 20 years here with growing horror, I think that a lot of it is him personally, but one of the things he personally believes is kind of a pan-Slavism, or I would put it more strongly than that. I would say Slav supremacism is what he believes is a kind of, I mean, this is a regime that's, it tries to support its popularity by promoting racism, by attacking, gay Russians, trying to curry favor with, say, the Russian Orthodox Church by implying that it's going to be conservative on religious issues. But in fact, what it's doing, is violating every international law there is. I don't think it's just that Putin, wants personal glory or something. I do think that he thinks he's doing this for Russia, right? But the policy is one of dominance over a whole sphere of influence through terror, and by the use of buffer states between him. In this case, what that would mean is not to prevent Western armies rolling across Eastern Europe towards Moscow. That obviously is never going to happen, but rather to prevent cultural influence, which is stupid in the internet age. But he seems to think that somehow, just to insulate Russia from any taint of democratic ideals coming in. Yeah, that's, I think, what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that, Putin is really eager to enter world history and Russian history as the gatherer of all the Russian lands. This year marks the centennial of the establishment of the Soviet Union, which was set up in 1922. So to some extent, maybe it's not an accident that he decided to launch this military campaign in order to rewrite history. And even when there were discussions of some peace negotiations just in this week's, and the Russian government insisted on scheduling a meeting in the Belaruskaya Pusha area in Belarus, where in 1991, communist leaders of Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Russia, and Soviet Belarus met together and signed a deal that basically led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he wants, basically the Ukrainian government to meet in the same place and, basically, and the existence of Ukrainian state and reconstitute the Soviet Union in a new format.
Wow. We have a few more minutes left. I'd like you to respond to maybe the point about a question about Belarus. Why do you think Belarus is supporting Russia and sort of willing to go against Ukraine?
Yeah, I said just something about this in the chat. I mean, again, Olena may know more details of kind of polling inside Belarus, but we have to remember that, less than a year ago, there were marches that, I don't know, I'm sure that by the end of it, more than 1 million people had been on the streets in Belarus because the election was rigged to re-elect Lukashenko there. And so he's, a puppet even more than Yanukovych was in Ukraine. And these, peace protests were met with, with brutal thousands of people arrested, tortures, secret police disappearances in the night, the whole 9 yards, just like the Stasi in East Germany or the military junta in Haiti, or pick any example you want. It's just like that. And so here's another case. Did NATO, threaten Russia? No, we did too little. Imagine we had armed some of those protesters when it really got ugly there, and they had won. And Belarus was now a democracy. Putin wouldn't have been able to send his troops into Ukraine through Belarus. So that itself is part of the reason we're in the mess we are today, because we let him crush those poor people in Belarus last year.
Yeah, I just want to add that President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has been known, nicknamed in the past as Europe's last dictator.
Yeah.
I mean, he was elected first as president in 1994. So he has been in power for 28 years. In the past, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Lukashenko was the most kind of notorious dictator in Europe. Of course, now Putin far exceeded him in his malign acts, but Lukashenko has been able to stay in power in no small degree due to Russia's support, military support, and also Russia's provision of cheap subsidized energy resources to maintain Belarusian economy. And many ordinary Belarusians, of course, side with Ukrainians, but their voice is not heard because the country is ruled by an autocrat.
I agree. Yeah.
Maybe I can ask one last question for today's discussion. Can France or Germany do anything to change the outcome of events in Ukraine?
No fly zone. They need to. If you look historically, in the last 20 years, France has proven willing to fight. Germany has generally not, although they supported the NATO mission in Afghanistan. I mean, France has been engaged in Mali, trying to fight ISIS in the Maghreb there. It's actually pulling back from that now. It was actively engaged in, trying to do something to stop Assad in Syria. But I guess just for historical reasons, the German government, I think the new, Olaf Scholz and the new coalition ruling Germany, still thinks that peaceful diplomatic means that somehow diplomacy can work without any stick behind it, which is just, a non-starter with someone like Putin. Very late in the game now, they seem to have changed judgment. Nord Stream 2 is off. Now we're going to send arms to Ukraine. So I think there's been an about face there. But if they had been stronger a few weeks earlier, again, maybe we wouldn't be seeing the devastation of a total country. And a worldwide recession is going to be the result of this. I don't know. Elena, do
you have any thoughts, Professor?
Being critical of Germany, but
Yeah. Professor Nikolayenko, do you have any thoughts about what other European countries should be doing?
Well, I mean, military aid and the no-fly zone. Yeah, I mean, there is. I don't think there is any other way. I mean, the introduction of some sort of like oil embargo can put a heavy strain on the Russian economy. And maybe over years, or the course of months, it can experience the negative effects of oil embargo, but it might take months, and by the time I don't know what would happen to Ukraine, to Ukrainian people.
Can I say one thing about the long run issue of energy in Europe and so? It's going to be very hard to make Europe independent of Russian energy. I mean, we even import 10% of our oil for gasoline from Russia, as now is becoming widely known. I think in the long run, it would take like a huge investment, and maybe 5-10 years at least. We could start shipping natural gas. It requires liquefying it, putting it in boats. We could do a lot more of that. And there's other countries that could do the same. And this could be the beginning of a big push in Europe to try to become free of Russian energy dependence. And that, in the long run, will really hurt the Russian economy. And if Putin is out at some point, then it would be hurting people in Russia after him. But you have to remember, at the end of the Cold War, the policy of Western countries was light touch. We don't want to try to be heavy-handed with the new sort of fledgling democracy in Russia. We want to, to let them be independent and rule themselves and find their own way. That was Bill Clinton's policies. The result was a depression. The Russian economy declined by 40%. Surprisingly, a strong man came into power after that. It is really a repeat of the 1930s. And so we have to be conscious of that with a long run strategy here. I would put a lot of the blame of what's happening here on one man. The humanity has been just incredibly unlucky with Vladimir Putin. If this guy had never risen to power, the world might be very different across many nations than we're looking at now. So if we could get rid of him, Russian generals, are you listening? There might be a lot of opportunities, to move forward in more positive ways. Probably we should have engaged more actively, with a Marshall Plan for Russia in the 1990s. There are a lot of analysts who say this now in retrospect, 2020 hindsight. This last comment I'll say, I guess, on this for today, we were just debating this in class. Is it really better to have blanket sanctions that could go on for a long time, and that really do cause another, major economic downturn for a long period in Russia, versus a short, hot war? Suppose NATO, and Russia each lost 15 fighter planes, in wars over the skies in Ukraine. And that led Putin to say, well, I'm not going to be able to continue the bombing. I have to come to an end to it. Wouldn't that be better than what we're now doing? The assumption that negotiations, economic sanctions, containment is always better. I find it sort of very simplistic thinking.
John, that is a very provocative note to end the discussion on. I think a lot of comments would be nervous about what you just said, but anyhow, I would like to thank both of you for your time and for your ton of information.
Thank you. And of course, we didn't have a chance to talk about China, but this is something that is also can serve as a deterrent for Russia, because Russia's plan is to rely on China as its main trade partner in the face of its isolation in the West. Yeah.
And China now will be in Taiwan within 3 years. I'll just tell you right now, there's no. After this, if this succeeds in Ukraine, they'll move forward the plan that they had sometime in this decade to invade Taiwan. Whereas imagine that Putin was gone and Russia was transforming again into a democracy, China would be the last sort of dictatorial superpower in the world. Things would look extremely different.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna wrap it up. There's a lot more to talk about, but thank you for your presentations and for everybody for joining us today.
Email me if you have questions.